Hello and welcome to the Stafford Beer Brain of the Firm reading group with General Intellect Unit. This time we are continuing our read through Chapter 18 and we are starting on the section called The October Perspective on page 318. So now we're going to get into sort of the end of this period, Beer's most ambitious plans here, and sort of a prelude to how they failed. So let's get started. The core group struggled with these matters as the Gremio battle recrudesced, with the prognosis that stocks would finally run out on Tuesday the 24th. On the 20th, the president was reported in vigorous words. Solo me sacarán de la moneda dentro de un pijama de madera. They'll only drag me out of the presidential palace in wooden pajamas. He meant it. And this time his will prevailed. On the same day, I was setting up the research already mentioned into the social uses of algedonic meters at Sarin, and wondering how the use of any such tool might affect minority aggression within a democracy. So speaking here of the petty bourgeois gremios as the minority. On the same day, also, I gave the first draft of the diagram at figure 46 to the undersecretary. So figure 46 is a diagram that is labeled, well, it doesn't actually have a label, but at the top you can see cybernetic and political analysis. So this is an attempt to provide a broader national cybernetic model that features CyberSyn as only one component in a broader perspective. It also includes the 5 principles, which we discussed previously. So it attempted to give perspective to all that we were doing and to mark the October turning point in our preoccupations. The picture presented by the diagram does not need a commentary, but it should not be passed over too lightly. It took us a long time to discuss all its implications. Although Project CyberSyn was to continue as planned until the government's overthrow, it was hardly surprising that from this time I should devote only a fraction of my time to it. The same was true for other core group members, to the mystified chagrin of many scientists working on CyberSyn who could not appreciate why we were infrequently seen. So Beer kind of making excuses here for what was obviously something that pissed off the scientists working on CyberSyn, but from his perspective, he kind of did the groundwork and now it was their job to run the thing. He felt like his attention could be better spent elsewhere. October was nearly over. A very long and crucial meeting between Flores, Espejo, Schwembe, Farnay, and myself reviewed the whole experience. We should proceed with all our plans, but they were now secondary to national survival. The training program should be furthered with all speed, but facilities and funding for the films would be most difficult to arrange, wherever they were made. This problem passed back to me. The new network that had given embodiment to the third of the 5 principles during the crisis must be maintained, built upon, and turned into a permanent feature in support of the new cooperative structures that were rapidly emerging in the countryside. There was much more. As the political dust settled, the cabinet resigned en bloc, as was inevitable, so that the president could make fresh dispositions. On The 2nd of November, the new cabinet was formed, and Fernando Flores was now Minister of Economics. The problem area of his direct responsibility had enlarged again. Moreover, the attempts in the reshuffle to accommodate the aspirations of all members of the coalition were to lead to such a degree of sectarian rivalry within the cabinet and the top echelons of administrative power that the viability of the government itself became a more urgent question than the viability of the economy. The role of the military was an ever-present and shifting complication. This is something that Beer mentions here, but it's not the case that the military was strictly counter-revolutionary. There were different figures who had different political affiliations, and Pinochet was the one that the CIA found to do a coup. You know, he was a reactionary and could be persuaded to do so. But the military was not like totally lockstep united in their opposition to the government. And the other thing to mention, I guess, here is that the government that was in power, the revolutionary government, was a coalition government, and that's why these sectarian divides became so acute. Back in England during November, I was pursuing many plans already mooted in these chapters, and trying to guide progress with the operations room in Santiago by conversational telex from London. There were meetings with filmmakers and financiers about the proposed films. The basic postulate being that 10 training films could be made in support of this very book, and sold internationally to management schools at a modest profit so that Chile would get the set free. Obviously, however, they would need to be more general in their relevance than we should wish in the context of Cybersyn. Once again, it was frustrating to have important developments at the national level held up by such small considerations. While all these efforts continued in London, quieter moments were devoted to the realities of life 8,000 miles away. They were filled with concern about instability of the country, of the government, and of the economy at large. Systemic instability is a cybernetic concept, and it has cybernetic solutions. But these have to be formulated within the bounds of political practicability. The sectarian struggle was destabilizing in itself, while the activities of foreign agencies reflected, as has been officially documented, deliberate strategy of destabilization. Although it was still possible to discuss these large issues with the minister, qua cabinet member, it seemed clear that any action proposal would have to be pitched within the context of his own ministry. Here, his promotion meant that we were addressing a new level of recursion, in which the projects so far being developed were attributable as Systems 1. Messages arrived from Chile that confirmed this orientation. There were large questions surrounding the public stance that a relatively unknown minister should adopt. In short, here was a System 5 function to fulfill that belonged to a recursion midway between that of the Organization for Regulating the Social Economy as a Viable System and that of the Collegiate Cabinet Organization for Preserving the State as a Viable System. Secondly, and very naturally following the October experience, the organization of the supply of essential goods for the population needed special attention. The population itself, alert to its vulnerability in this respect, was rapidly engaging in measures to confirm and improve the techniques of distribution that had sprung into being during the stoppage. Autonomous self-organizing units were developing to cover neighborhoods, then villages, and even working places whereby the producer, the worker himself, could be connected to the consumer himself directly. Such development threatened to eliminate commerce as such, and with it, of course, the gremios. These developments deserved encouragement, and it seemed that the only administrative intervention that would be needed would be to provide some version of a System 2 capable of regulating metabolism in the total system. There would, however, remain policy determinants on the central axis. Acute shortages of basic food must invoke mandatory rationing in some form, and the government still had its social policy for fairer shares than those traditionally awarded according to the extreme socioeconomic stratification of the populace. All right, so let's talk about this part here. Shane, go ahead.
Isn't that last paragraph just amazing, right? That like even in the midst of this problem, right? The Flores promotion starting to kind of cause these kind of problems, or like this new level of recursion spiraling into view that they had to deal with. But on the ground, autonomous self-organizing units were doing this sort of stuff, and in such a way that it was going to eliminate commerce. It was just going to reconfigure value and production and distribution and everything. And like it was happening. It was sort of the germinal stuff was ongoing even while they were dealing with these very high level problems. That's really great. Yeah.
I really think we see here, as you said, kind of the germinal form of like the abolition of the value form, right? Not in general, but like not outside of Chile, but perhaps inside of Chile. And the possibility that Beer sees of using Cybersyn-like systems to coordinate that.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe the thing that's it's I don't know, like the fact that these were happening autonomously, right? Like this is the kind of proof in the pudding of this notion of like autonomous units being coordinated. Mm-hmm. That like you have this technical infrastructure to coordinate autonomous action, mm-hmm. and it just starts ticking away doing the thing. It's almost like it's a kind of the way like a genomic replicator kind of programs what proteins are going to do, and then they just sort of do them, right? Like, and that's very different from the like centralized kind of model, the Soviet model of like we're going to abolish the value form, but we're going to do it here in Moscow. You know, we're going to do it in our brains, and you're all going to have to play along with it. What the center parts here were struggling to deal with very high level problems, while the cellular level was just starting to do its thing autonomously. The plan was basically working. Yeah. This is exactly what you want to happen and you'd expect to happen. And it's very interesting that this didn't have to pass through Beer. Like the people abolishing the value form didn't have to go through him or go through one of these departments. It was just that the technical infrastructure to do it was working, and just the thing was just brewing away.
Yes, I agree. I think we see here a lot of the contradictions of sort of the dictatorship of the proletariat coming to a head, and we can see, you know, the dynamics of the withering of the state are at play here. You can see them. Of course, they're frustrated ultimately, but it is very interesting to see them pop up. Okay, so Matt, and then, Jake, and then Matt.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what you said about the sort of autonomy. I think it's cool. It's cool to see that, you know, this sort of idea of, well, just provide the people with the tools and the knowledge to make their own decisions about their lives, and they'll tend towards this, like, well, commerce was in the process of being eliminated. Like, people, if given the true choice, like given the possibility of choosing something different, are choosing to, like, you know, why do I go through these small business people, like people who hoard this food and all that stuff? Like, I should just be talking with the producers directly, or, you know, through these system two, I guess, that the government is creating. I think it's definitely very encouraging to think about the kind of, like, in terms of the project of socialists. I've increasingly been seeing it a lot as like, just connect the right people to the right people. You know, it's just a matter, like, that's what organizing is. It's just like finding the people who have the things that you need, or the skills that you need, or the skills that other people need, and connecting them. And that sounds like simple, but it's like really complex, and there's a lot of nuance to it. And clearly there's there's all these forces at play, which frustrates it, but ultimately, like, that's what, if you believe that the working class can run the world, if you believe that regular people have the capacity to understand their lives and what they need, then it really does become about how do you empower them to get the things they need and to give the things that they have to the people that need it. So I think that's really cool. Definitely good to, it's good to sort of see that they were concerned with the question of like this larger system, in which Chile is just like a system one of it, sort of being the world capitalist system. It's a shame they didn't get a chance to like really like integrate, or not integrate, but disintegrate that system, get out of that place that they're stuck in. It's frustrating that fucking coup happened. I hate fascists.
I mean, yeah, I definitely hate fascists. But it's like they're like building communism over here, and they can't even make a couple documentary films because they're so cash strapped. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, even hearing about what went wrong is, I find honestly very encouraging, because it's easy to get into as like a correction of like hyper tech optimism. It's easy to fall into like an overcorrection of tech pessimism. Stuff like flying cars and the falling rate of profit. Yeah, they'll make some important points. But the flip side is that there actually have been like massive technical changes between when this was happening and now, and like a lot of the stuff that legitimately stood in his way, is just not even a thing now. You have a you wouldn't need to fly to London to get some films produced. He'd be able to produce a passable one with what was in his pocket. That wouldn't even be a thing. Also, I was thinking about further up when it's talking about like the continuous monitoring with the algorithmic signals, and just contrasting that with like the election. It is kind of absurd that we have these high stakes elections. The fact that there's anything, the fact that there is such a thing as electoral strategy, says that what you're ostensibly trying to do, measure popular opinion so that you carry out the will of the people, is obviously false. Because if you're taking into account stuff like whether it's going to be raining that day, or all these little maneuvering tactical things, it shows that the whole thing is kind of absurd. Having these high stakes elections. I've heard actually other cybernetics people say we basically make a 1 bit. We send 1 bit every 4 years. Which is insane. Yeah, something more like an algorithmic signal that actually has continuous polling, I think would make a lot more sense.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know if you could necessarily structure a government according to continuous polling, but having that be the only way that people interact with the government is really ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, what a state of affairs. So I think it's really that question of time scales that Beer brings up all the time, needing to understand time scales and needing to calibrate according to reasonable time scales. Because I mean, I don't think it's necessary. Even in an all-out war, the different sides are going to have punctuated periods of activity where you have battles. It does make sense in some ways to have those punctuated marks, but not like this. This is ridiculous. Okay. Right. So, architectonics of the new recursion were formulating in my mind, but I wanted to discuss the issues in depth before attempting a written statement. By the end of November, I was back in Santiago, arriving just before the president left for Cuba en route to the United Nations. There, he was to make a famous address about the Chilean plight under the monstrous burdens of economic blockade and covert political intervention. This provoked worldwide sympathy and no helpful action whatsoever. Solidarity! Yeah, very true. Isn't it always that way? Yeah. Can think of many examples of this happening. But while I was yet in England, my compatriot and friend Ross Ashby, discoverer of the law of requisite variety, who had retired to his home in the West Country a few years earlier, died at the age of 69. Cybernetics thereby lost the further teachings of a great man whose genius is still far from being properly recognized. The event left me personally depleted. So, dealing with this problem internationally, seeing Allende, frustrated at the UN, and then hearing that Ashby died, putting Beer into a depression is kind of the summary of that situation. A new recursion. It is easily stated, and perhaps readily understood from this vantage point, that we were now dealing with a new level of recursion, if only because the sponsor of the cybernetic approach had emerged as minister. It was not obvious at the time, although it was clear that something was different. Some perhaps saw this simply as a gain in prestige and authority for the work, because the man was the same man, and his contributions to the inner councils of the president had always been effective, whatever his official job. Again, the ostensible cybernetic effort was perceived as being concentrated at Corfu, where Project Cybersyn had been started and where it was still housed. Its growing professional staff was increasingly remote from the center of cybernetic activity, the core group, which was in turn expanding. This itself had no institutional focus and was thereby rendered invisible, even perhaps to its own members, who were wholly preoccupied in urgent political tasks and economic assignments such as directing industrial sectors. Although Cybersyn itself had still to be scientifically directed, there was much else for me to do, and I did not even meet most of the latterly recruited staff. It was December 1972. After October, the priorities were changed, as I have already said. None knew this better than the minister himself, and his response was to draw sharply back from Cybersyn to the consternation of many, the gratification of a few, and the obfuscation of the recursion issue. The consternation was felt by those who regarded Cybersyn as a political instrument, and who thought they saw political support incipiently withheld. The gratification was experienced by the technocratically minded who wanted effective management regardless of the political framework. The emergence of a new recursion was obscured because all the circumstances recounted in these two paragraphs seemed adequate to explain why, quote-unquote, things were different, and they did not point to any structural problem in the recursive mapping of the economy. There was one, however. If we think back to the original modeling of November 1971, we find the economy defined in terms of its assets, the land, minerals, industry, and the ownership of those assets, which in turn defined the public and private sectors. All the emphasis was on the shift from private to public ownership, which was creating what was called the social economy. It was therefore natural to everyone to structure their approach to organization in terms of the assets owned. The land had its own agricultural ministry. Ownership of that land had been a major political issue for many years, and important changes had already been introduced before this government arrived, although they had been much accelerated. As far as the Ministry of Economics was concerned, ownership related to industry, and economic regulation related in the first place to the effective management of the assets that constituted that industry. Thus, it was political reality which originated the hierarchy of enterprises, sectors, ramas, and the administrative apparatus to go with it. And it was cybernetic necessity which mapped that reality onto a recursive nest. So far, so good. But the preoccupation with ownership makes sense only insofar as it betokens ruling power. Increasingly, we find that other factors supervene. Hence, privately owned industry in the West complains that the trade unions exercise too much power, and dissident minorities in all advanced societies are often accused of holding the majority to ransom. In all contemporary societies where such movement is not forcibly repressed, there seems to be a resurgence in the self-organizing capability of communities to promote themselves as viable systems, independently of, or even set against, a moribund authority that derives from archaic and legalistic courts of appeal. Thus, it was in Chile by the end of 1972. The model we were using until then could not adequately represent changes that had come about during Allende's term, and which had crystallized around the events of October, because these were changes in economic management that had nothing to do with ownership in the legal sense. To be precise, the ownership model nominated only owned assets, whether public or private, as viable systems, which between them constituted an exhausted System 1. The community, considered only in its economic role, of course, was part of the environment with respect to System 1 and was connected to System 1 operations by a homeostatic loop labeled demand in one direction and supply in the other. The distribution function was depicted as metabolizing that homeostat. Certainly, and continuing the use of the ownership filter on our spectacles, the distribution function was largely owned by the gremios, and therefore this homeostat was vulnerable to disruption. But this fact does not necessarily turn commerce into a System 1. All subsystems of the viable system, as elucidated by the model, are regarded as essential components of viability in any case, so survival depends on them all. Then, so long as the management of assets determined the composition of System 1, this mapping of the model obeyed all the cybernetic conventions as well as reflecting political reality, and I still consider it to have been adequate to the task originally imposed upon it. What was happening, however, as described at the end of the last section, powerfully suggested that two levels of recursion were mixed together in that preliminary model. It took a great deal of analysis to understand why this was, how it happened, and therefore what could be done about it. In the end, I think that most of the difficulty experienced at this point was due to an ideological hyperbole. What we had modeled was the public sector of industry in N recursions, and it had the label the social economy. The social economy, however, turned out to be more than this, and in order to model the ministerial totality, we needed an extra level of recursion. The evidence that this was so presented itself uniquely in my experience, and this made it difficult to recognize and later to explain. The economic community, something different from the demographic community, was itself a viable system, because it had grown a management that was quite independent of the whole business of ownership. The distributive function, something different from transportation, was also a viable system because it too had grown a management that was quite independent of the gremio ownership. These two managements were the systems 543 of the two viable systems that were part of the social economy, but not part of the set of industrial recursions. Then the social economy and public industry were not, after all, coextensive. The latter was a System 1 of the former. So the public industry was a System 1 of the social economy. This conclusion identified the missing recursion. It needed to offer an at least tripartite account of the internal economy, in which owned industry was only a component System 1, along with various others. The distribution function, or commerce, in quotation marks because it is conceived as independent of ownership, and community, in quotation marks because it is conceived as an economic instrument, had identified themselves because of their emerging managements, which were, it needs repeating, independent of the norms of the industrial model. Then, of course, there could be others, as yet not identified. All right. So I think this is a really interesting section because we start to get into the limitations of the slogan, seize the means of production. I think that we really see here, okay, you set up the dictatorship of the proletariat, you seize the means of production. Now new contradictions start to appear, and those slogans which were useful in initiating the revolution now become obstacles to the revolution. So it's very interesting. So let's go to Jeremy, and then Shane, and then Jake.
So in the heart of enterprise, there's a section, I think it's either the last or the second last section of the book, has very, very extended examples of applying the viable system model. And one of them is tracking a particular mega corporation over more than a decade. And there's a part where they all have to rewrite the model because there are levels of recursion that existed in subsequent iterations that didn't exist in the beginning iteration. And Beer gives examples where the original model did not take everything into account and new recursions had to be stuffed in, and also other places where over the evolution of time, new recursions emerge and have to be reapplied to the model. I think this is a very, very difficult problem. So I think you need to flag this. If we're ever going to be doing this kind of analysis, this is a serious, serious problem, both the problem of getting the original model wrong and also the problem of what happens with time evolution in the model, creating new recursions that really do have to be perceived. And in the particular context here, I think I'm reminded of how Mao's writing changed between like the Long March era and later on when he was running all of China, that, okay, great, we now have political control, but there's still tons and tons of problems implementing communism. How do we address that? Given that we have political control, we run the country, and yet communism isn't happening, what do we do? So I don't think Mao did that great a job with it. He kind of nuked the whole situation with the Cultural Revolution. That's one strategy, but it might not be the ideal strategy. I think both points are really important. One being how the model has to constantly be interrogated to see if we're missing recursions, and also how this applies to the time evolution of a socialist enterprise.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, so like an earlier thing is kind of interesting, like the when Beer is talking about the sense of like the project's growing and there's all these new people being recruited, and it gets to a point where he doesn't even really know any of the people that he's ostensibly working with. Reminds me of a thing from like startup land, where like your organization breaks every time it doubles in size. You know, it's like that's especially relevant in the very low part of the curve, right? Where you go, because you go through these like transition points where you go from like a team of 4 people or whatever who's working on a project, and then up to like it gets big enough that you have to do like cell division, and now the original 4 are kind of like working with others and stuff, and that you get that kind of definitely a point at which you kind of detect it in the air, like something is quite different, that like it's not the same unit anymore, and you have to kind of split things up. But yeah, this later thing is so interesting, right? That like if ownership and like property relations end up obscuring the real system, right? And we like if you think about that in capitalism, right? That like the sort of the whole body of social production, like the social organism, is partitioned according to ownership, and its regulation is partitioned by ownership, which is not actually a sensible way of organizing anything. It doesn't like ownership doesn't correspond to activity, right? So there's these real processes and these real feedback loops in the social body. And then there's this model of hierarchical ownership, and they don't really correspond at all. So these property relations obscure real social relations. I mean, look, marks.txt.jpg or whatever. But yeah, this thing like the whole Marxist thing, or who knows if the guy had lived till he was 300 and actually got to write all the books he wanted to write, maybe there would be something more to this. But the emphasis on seizing the means of production. It's worth dwelling on this, right? Like, is it possible that, like, by focusing on the sort of degenerated, broken mirror version of social relations, that we would risk taking those over and then replicating them, and then missing the fact that they don't actually mean anything in terms of social organization? Because, like, yeah, I mean, this is what they encountered, right? Like that the initial revolution had to focus on like ownership. But then when they got it, they started to realize, hold on, the physiology of this body that we thought was there, it's not real. The thing has its own physiology entirely that's different from ownership. And then, like, industry ends up being just one of the subsystems of this whole social body. It's a sibling of community. It's a sibling of commerce or whatever, the distribution function. There's a lot going on there that's not the means of production. It's not workplace stuff. It's so strange, right? And it's very interesting that they happened upon this and realized this. And I think this is probably one of the bigger lessons we need to take forward, that property and ownership and stuff are very important, and we have to take the power of the capitalists away. But the property itself isn't the point, really. We would want to scrape away the broken mirror and reveal what's actually beneath it.
Right. I think the thing with seizing the means of production is that, it's about seizing the use values. It doesn't say nationalize the means of production or buy the means of production. It says seize the means of production.
Tell that's the Labour Party,
So, nationalization could be seen as a form of seizure of the means of production. But it is important to note that it's mediated through ownership relations in a way that Marx's slogan doesn't necessarily imply. And so, I think that what Beer is saying here is completely consonant with the critique of political economy. And, just kind of getting at, that structuring society according to an alien power of capital implies these ownership relations which are not elemental to human relationships, and which they do create social labor in a new scale, but that doesn't mean that we can't transcend that and achieve a social labor at a higher level.
Absolutely right. I mean, but like as always, the problem is not really Marx; it's Marxists. Like it's the tradition after Marx is the kind of problem. But like, yeah, the stuff is foregrounded, like as nationalization or like, taking control of what exists is the kind of the objective, and then that degrades into like DSA people thinking that communism is when your employer gives you free dental or whatever.
Well, think about an alternate scenario, right? Like think about something like the Meidner Plan. If the Meidner Plan had succeeded, then the workers' pension funds would own pretty much all of the capital in Sweden. And you would have ownership of the means of production in that sense. But nothing that Beer is talking about here would be achieved.
You'd still have to go to your shitty job.
Yeah, you would still be operating under the same property relations as before. It's just that, you could, like the Workers' Party could direct investment better, and you have a better pension, right? So,
which would converge on the problem of like socialists or communists ending up just being better caretakers of capital, right? Like,
yes,
which is the fucking thing that haunts us all the time, right?
Yeah. So again, this gets back to the need to abolish the value form, and abolish property relations of this sort, private property, or we should say even public property, because in a sense, public property can be just as alienated as private property. Mm-hmm. So, okay. Anyway,
you get one toothbrush and that's fucking it.
Right.
No. Usual caveat: property is not whatever. But anyway.
Yeah. It's not personal property. Okay, Jake, go ahead, and then we'll go to Matt, Boast and Matt.
Yeah, definitely agree with all of that. I think, it's kind of I like that he's kind of working through the like we thought it was ownership, but turns out there's something deeper, and sort of the way that this model still does accurately map onto things, but it's just like, what are you actually? It kind of gets back to, I feel like, some of the problems that we were discussing when he really laid out the VSM in kind of like chapters like 12 through 15 or whatever. Sorry. People like to ride around dirt bikes in Philly. Anyway, and like talking about like the question of like, well, what are we actually mapping here? Like, what are the things that are sent up, when we consider like an economy level or even like national level, whatever, like system, VSM. It's like these inputs aren't going to be figured out until you try it, until you like unleash the creative potential of the society to actually like provide like, oh, hey, this is what we're seeing. This is what we are providing, and it's not actually what you thought it was at first. And sort of the need for flexibility with that, you can't just be wedded to that idea of like, well, what are you talking about? Like, this is the workers' state, and the state is now the owner, and so therefore the workers now control the means of production. But it's like, no, the state owns the means of production. That doesn't tell you whether the control can be enforced. I think is a real big thing. Is like, it's just like, you see like laws. I've seen like a bunch of laws get passed in like, in some U.S. state, but it's like, are they going to enforce those laws? How do they enforce them? It's like thinking about it at something that's a little more like, you have to really grapple with where the rubber meets the road. You can't just say like, well, we've done it and now it's done. It's like, no, you have to investigate and see if what you've done is what you wanted and what the people want. And so I think it's definitely like, I like that he sort of worked through it. And it's like, no, this is actually part of this larger system of which this is just a system one. And, if we can figure out the right things to look at when we're making these models, it can really help us actually figure out if we've arrived, right? Like, do we still have how much more work do we still have to do? What do we still have to do to actually get worker control over society, And I also like just that it's not just about ownership. It's not just about control. It's about what are the pieces that are interacting, because it is all these systems, they're hugely complex and they have all these moving parts. And so the question is like, what are the important parts that we have to be concerned with? Which parts need to interact in which ways to be able to say we've achieved, abolishment of the value form or whatever. And it definitely like, if there was any doubt that like previous attempts, especially like the early 20th century, like didn't achieve socialism or communism, like they really just, they made attempts, but it's clear like those things are not sufficient. And you kind of have to always be doing the self-reflection. I think that's another thing that, Beer is trying to get at with the constant, like, with these homeostats and everything and these like algorithmic channels of like automatic feedback, because it's like you can't ever not be self-reflexive or you're going to die. I mean, that's kind of the whole thing of the VSM, right? You need that overall look of the system, or the system spirals out into the constituent parts, and the cohesive goals are lost, and I think it's definitely it's very important.
Right. And I mean, the thing is, like, we don't want a worker state. We don't want there to be a state, and we don't want there to be workers. And we're going to see this play out in the rest of this chapter. This contradiction is going to start to come to the fore when it gets to the question of management versus workers. When we sort of talk as like social democrats about perfecting the worker state, or as Leninists about building a worker state, I mean, we don't really want to build a worker state, like, because that implies a kind of social stasis that we're not interested in. If perfecting the worker state is the goal we end up with, then it's a failure, because we're talking about human liberation here, not the perfection of labor. Okay, so Boast and then Matt.
So I'll try to keep it short since I'm echoing a lot of things that have already been said, but it really kind of talks about this paradox where you need to both seize the means of production and the means of social reproduction simultaneously. But whereas the means of production is like, oh, it's that factory over the hill, the means of social reproduction is the stories that people have been telling each other, the relations that have been allowing people to have these kind of informal markets amongst themselves, and all of these like greater pieces of social machinery that Beer is talking about. And I think it's really telling that it seems like he did try to engage with this social machinery early on, at least, in these movies and these films that he's trying to develop, where he's like, I want to get into these social engines and, not just impact them, but also learn from them, because like, you're going to end up with these ideological hyperboles, as he mentioned, if you keep approaching these like incredibly varied, social systems with the mindset of a very specific, like industrial engineer. So I just think like it's a paradox that I'm not sure if it was Beer's own training as like a very industrially minded person, or the timeline that made like the understanding of social reproduction just outside of their grasp, or something that they couldn't really put all of their resources towards.
I mean, he talks in Figure 46 about the people system, as opposed to the cybersyn system or the recursive model. Now, this diagram was kind of formulated prior to his breakthrough of understanding better the role of the nature of the social economy, because it still relies on that kind of bourgeois distinction between the people the social and the economic. Whereas I think that's starting to get more mixed up once he gets to Figure 47. And you start to see the social and the economic intermingling with each other and cross-contaminating each other. So I think that the breakdown of that distinction in his work, I would see as a kind of progress, for sure. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, man. And like watching them struggle with this. I mean, like between hearing about like some of this stuff and obviously like Richard Wolff talking about worker cooperatives. Like, I mean, like that's honestly what kind of made me take like socialism seriously. Like, just like actually someone getting into the nuts of like what does it actually mean for workers to own the means of production, or why would that be better? And especially like with him going into like like the command and control here, because title ownership doesn't actually necessarily mean that much. The example always comes to mind for me is the National Coal Board in the UK, where just that spoil was just piling up around Aberfan, and the miners who worked there were complaining, but there was just no that telephone didn't lead anywhere. And I do think the cybernetic proposition being that communication is control, and like setting up these command and control flows is like that's how you actually do it. And it is this whole thing, like the fact that they're actually getting into the nuts and bolts of how capitalism is an ecosystem of institutions, and some of them consciously created, and some of them actually kind of not. Some of them kind of happen incidentally, and so switching from one to the other, there's just so much crap you got to do. So just really useful data set here.
Yeah, I think Beer's emphasis on the existence of unnamed or unplanned institutions is really valuable. It's a good thing to keep in mind whenever doing organizational analysis, because these things do pop up and they're important, but they don't necessarily have a legal charter or organizational charter. Matt, go ahead.
Another thing that popped to mind was also just I've heard people say things along the lines of consolidation of industry, which is a natural dynamic under capitalism, and it is more efficient. Actually is kind of a template for socialism. It gets arrested because the bourgeoisie can hit the brakes at a certain point once it's not serving their interests. But I mean I do kind of see actually how the process of industries consolidating into these massive trusts, there's something to it. They wind up creating these little incidental institutions also.
In terms of what do you mean? How does the consolidation create little institutions?
So like AWS, Amazon created a computer system to help them manage their logistics, and that wound up spinning off into this other thing, with all these other services that they sold to other businesses. You got these this discovery process that winds up happening, or there's all these little professional societies that just wind up springing up. Mm-hmm. Those wind up being patronized, by the surplus of really, really big companies. It's not really so much small producers that really do that.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Like the coder lecture circuit and so on. Okay. For the purposes of explaining the new recursion at any rate, and out of all the activity going on in the countryside, the emergent non-ownership managements to which I drew attention were the neighborhood councils, known as JAPs, Junta de Aprovisionamiento Popular, and the Comandos de Abastecimiento. That's my best gloss. Sorry. Who were local volunteer bodies supervising provisioning. Both forms of organization had been fundamentally self-generating, but each had an accepted status within administrative policy by this time. Indeed, the development of the commandos in particular had been considerably influenced by the conceptual use of this viable system model. Those closely involved had, for example, explained how they had rapidly understood the requirement for System 2 activity within this initially makeshift distribution system. Then, the cybernetic argument for the fresh architectonic took shape. The new recursion should be recognized with initially 3 systems 1. First would come the nest of industrial recursions with its regulatory procedures embodied in Project Cybersyn and presided over by the workers' committees at each recursive level. Next would come the nest of economic communities, in which all those regulatory activities already summed under the heading of the People Project would find their embodiment, presided over by the JAPs. These would be linked by the third viable system, replacing existing commerce with the new commerce, over which the commandos already presided. The regulatory procedures needed here could be very rapidly provided because they already existed in the standard toolkit of operational research. Thus, an allocation project became a possibility, which would seek to satisfy demand in an effective fashion using mathematics as well as organizational techniques. So we see in figure 47 the levels of recursion, the proposed new level of recursion in the Ministry of Economics, which collects into System 1 existing projects that may be inspected on a 90-degree rotation. So we have industry, commerce, and community, as Beer described them, as these System 1s, which are linked to their environment, industry being materials, commerce being agriculture, and community being region. And we can also see here how the systems 3, 4, 5 are Project Cybersyn, the Allocation Project, and then the People Project. Those are all listed together, and the System 5s are the Workers' Committees, the Commandos, and the JAPs. And then all of this together is aggregated into the Ministry of Economics. The layout of the new level of recursion is shown in figure 47 with its 3 systems 1. By turning the page through 90 degrees, the second level of recursion may be inspected. Details of the model for industry would be unchanged from those given in the last chapter. The models for community and commerce would seek to map the nests of recursions already organizing themselves on the ground. For instance, the so-called industrial belts were now emerging. These were self-organizing entities in the cybernetic sense that arose in response to the bureaucracy of the sector committees of Corfo itself. Again, cybernetic workshops were held, and proved to be positive experiences for all concerned. Derinko is shown as operating on the parasympathetic loop. This was a government agency concerned with fair trading and price control. It had all the marks of this high variety regulator, as had been explicitly recognized a year earlier. If we had not been active in its regard, it was because we had compressed 2 levels of recursion into 1. By the same token, we ought to have been able to have predicted the System 2 commandos had 2 levels of recursion within the model of the ministry, which had been teased apart in advance. Now, however, everything was falling into place. The whole system, as depicted in figure 47, looked robust, but it really needed a new set of communications to vitalize the major loops at the ministerial level of recursion. It was now obvious that the original Cybernet, belonging to the second level of recursion, industry, for which it had been designed, was not adequate at the higher ministerial level of recursion, although it had been successfully dragooned into that role during the October emergency. Again, intuitions were sparking ahead of the formal analysis. For the core group had already generated the thought that a new version of the post office could provide the network of algorithm nodes that the ministry needed for internal regulation at the metasystemic level. Certainly, that idea fitted perfectly with this architectonic and with my own belief that although Cybernet could not properly handle the topographical requirements of the ministerial recursion, CyberStride could indeed handle its filtration needs. For I could think of no regulatory indicator appropriate to the two new components of System 1 at the higher level of recursion that could not readily be expressed as a triple index. So, some dimensions of cyber sin are left at that level of recursion, and other ones can be pulled up to deal with these relationships between industry, commerce, and community. According to what's available and what's appropriate. To take an example, and it got no more than that, a community commando knows how much meat it has got, actual, and how much it would like, potential, while a rationing rubric applied to regionally available supplies could quickly compute how much meat it can have, capability. Then a triple index can be monitored to alert the commerce system to impending shortage at each next lower echelon, though through a supply equals productivity quotient. And the appropriate system 4 could be alerted to shifts in the investment, or in this case probably import level required to match not merely need but desire through a demand equals latency quotient, and so on throughout the model. In the outcome, it was Cybernet rather than Cyberstride that was expanded beyond industrial boundaries. It seems that the power of instant communication provides huge advances in regulatory finesse that can quickly be assimilated, and that the filtration system can be relatively crude. Ministries, the central bank, and many government agencies were incorporated into Cybernet at this point. The lesson has not yet been understood by other countries. All right, so let's talk about this section. Shane, go ahead.
That last bit seems like it's solved by the internet these days. We got all the internet connectivity we could ever want. I don't know. One of the other bits that jumps out is the integrating the newly self-emerging, self-organizing entities like these industrial belts, which I don't know seem to they emerge in response to the core flow activities. Mm-hmm. So like rather than just like being like how fucking dare you and smashing them, and they're like, oh yeah, cool, like this, it's just like let's integrate that into the fold.
Yes,
the like actual emergence of new things is not interpreted as a threat, which is refreshing, rather than like just sending a fucking battalion down there to fucking kill them or whatever.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Oh, it's very interesting. Okay, let's keep going then. So at that moment, the end of November 1972, and a year into the work then, it seemed possible by understanding the formal cybernetics of the radically changed situation, we might start to resolve what I certainly regarded as an alarming degree of political confusion. There was disagreement within the core group on almost every topic. Sets of economic advisors were coming and going and contradicting each other from within different sections of the ministry. The minister's priorities, the division of his attention between his ministry and the collegiate responsibility of the cabinet, and his own public posture were all matters of advice that divided his personal advisors. Probably none of this is very unusual when a government is under intense pressure. But the intellectual hubbub it creates does deafen one to conclusions that might otherwise be heard perfectly clear. To reach the structural conclusion recorded in Figure 47, to think through the variety engineering implicit in that model, which is eventually to lead to certain theoretical cybernetic advances, and to elaborate the necessary supportive detail as to praxis, was completely exhausting. Therefore, it would certainly tax my colleagues who were already very tired and busy in their own right. These are the realities of the implementation of management science when the situation is very stressful. It is important that the degree of stress be understood. Events are moving so quickly in such circumstances that it is almost impossible not to make a mistake. I go into some detail here because my records of the 2 relevant weeks are sufficiently thorough as to explain what I think was eventually a mistake. On the 30th of November 1972, I took Enrique Farnay into my confidence as to these proposed new plans. As head of the Nationalized Automobile Agency for the whole country, he was probably under more pressure than any other colleague. but he was the one best placed to collaborate in the implementation of any such ideas. We discussed them for 8 hours and agreed to meet Fernando Flores together as soon as we could. The meeting of the three of us took place the next day, Friday at 10:45 in the evening. I left Flores' house at 3 a.m. The minister's departing words are quoted in the log. The arguments are so cogent that I have no alternative. During the next 12 days, I wrote the plan down in a document entitled 1 Year of Relative Solitude. This title will convey a special meaning to readers of the writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but the subtitle was straightforwardly The Second Level of Recursion. These 12 days were exceptionally busy. Maybe their influence significantly changed the emphasis of the recommendations as originally advanced. At any rate, this was the gist of the written statement. Firstly, I was fairly confident about progress with Project Cybersyn considered as a piece of management development. All the project managers were enthusiastic about progress. Results were emanating from Checo. The Cyberstride PERT was on course, and meetings with those running inputs from the big nationalized industries were satisfactory. The operations room was under construction, and I was visiting it once or twice every day, often with impatient would-be users. Workers' representatives were becoming very interested and were full of suggestions. Given the evolution of Figure 47, the advocacy was to stand yet further back from the management of its Systems 1, which after all ought to be autonomous. For instance, there should be a director of total industry as chairman of System 5 in Recursion 2 industry, who would be a worker, and the tools already developed would be formally handed over. Evaluating the consequences, there ought to ensue a collapse of bureaucracy, a restructuring of the sector committees, if not their total abolition, and a replacement of technocratically oriented OR groups by workers' groups. Then this would change the problem of training as so far conceived. One could look forward to the day when, instead of being enticed into attending government courses, industrial workers' committees would be demanding service on the parasympathetic loop. Indeed, this was to happen when the dockers required to know why they were not yet involved, which was because transportation as a whole remained a politically intractable question. And yet, there was something manifestly starry-eyed about this set of expectations, and a sense of political realism had to insert those quotation marks. Quote-unquote expectations. More fundamental cybernetic analysis was continuing in an attempt to identify the deeper system whereby such changes are universally resisted, and the topic will reappear in Chapter 19. Secondly, I could see no problems in developing the two new nests of the new recursion, which would clear the path correctly to design the new metasystem for the ministry. In particular, the advocacy was to found the public posture of the new minister on the people's use of the people's science. Angel Parar, whom I met twice during those 12 days, and other artists were by now ready to join in such a campaign. Indeed, Parar sang the litany in public twice during that period. Separate meetings with all the members of the core group and several more with the minister led me to hope that all these plans were feasible. Pressing a little too hard, perhaps, the advocacy proposed a series of ministerial broadcasts on television and the public inauguration of the operations room by the president. Such moves were plausible and had been discussed before. If they now came over with a touch of overstatement, the error can perhaps be traced to another incident that occurred during the 12 days, when time was at such a high premium. At their own request, I saw a most distinguished pair of British television producers who had come to make a documentary film about Chile and its experiment. They already knew after one day what this documentary should say, and the travesty was eventually broadcast exactly as planned. Presumably, my role was intended to be to endorse the product. The impotent rage to which this interview reduced me was surely connected with the advocacy to use the medium properly and soon. These days of talks may have changed the emphasis in the written report as distinguished from the oral report. Certainly, there was no shift in the perception of social objectives, nor in the managerial cybernetics implicit in the organizational design. What was shifting, even from one day to the next, was the emphasis of sectarian politics. Fernando Flores had emerged from the events of October with an enhanced reputation and a cabinet post. By December, he was under constant and vitriolic attack in the press. Thus, the question as to what public actions were feasible for him was overriding. As far as I was concerned, I took little notice of the fact that various people were loudly suggesting that I had completed my contract, a circumstance that I should have taken more seriously. The report was not finished until breakfast time on the day of departure, and my close colleagues did not like it. I thought that perhaps there had not been enough time to take the ideas beyond the evangelical phase and out into solid theology, and that the meaning of the report would sink in during my brief absence over Christmas. Perhaps it did, insofar as the dual recursion idea was effectively assimilated and the conceptual model offered was adopted as a mode of thinking and talking. But there was no outcome in terms of organizational change or ministerial stance as I had advocated. Almost any explanation of this could be defended. The probability is that the freedom to maneuver in so powerfully constrained a situation is itself curtailed almost to zero. It is also likely that evangelism does not have requisite variety to complete any theological job. During my first late night walk in Santiago in the fateful year of 1973, which was to see the fall of the government and the death of many friends, I was dispirited. The city was peaceful enough, quiet even, but for the first time in the whole enterprise, I felt made alien. The words of Nietzsche were in my head. Our steps ring too lonely through their streets. All right, so any comments on this political section here at the end? Shane, go ahead.
Fucking Brits and their fucking documentary.
Yeah,
fucking swine.
That's classic BBC. You know, I don't know if it was BBC, but I could imagine it being BBC.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, scumbags. Yeah, I don't know. It's very disheartening, right? That like you can kind of feel the autumn air settling in now. You know, it's like yeah, they see the problems, and Beer's working around the fucking clock to like, and everyone else working around the clock to get all this shit happening. But as says at the end, yeah, it's constrained. There's very little wiggle room. Yeah, it ain't great.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the idea of abolishing management would certainly find some resistance from the parties that were supported by managers.
But there was also there was no spare capacity anywhere else to overcome that resistance, right? Like
yes.
it's constrained on all sides, right? Like it's constrained in the terms that you're up against a solid wall, right? That's a constraint. Yep. And then lacking the power to overcome the wall is a constraint, and so on. You know, it's there's a lot of different constraints there.
Yes. Okay, let's go to Jake and then Matt, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah, this definitely, like, this last section is just, you know, like, Beer comes into this whole thing not being very political, you know, like having these ideas that are very politically radical, or rather radical and would be radical if implemented, and then spends the whole time being like, guys, can't we just do the thing? Let's just do this. Let's stop. Like, why are you worried about these politics? You know, I'm sure he wasn't actually like that, but you know, that's kind of the vibe that this last bit gets. It's just like, and I get it, especially considering the outcome. You know, it's just like, if it weren't for these stupid politics, for people having their own personal investments in the way things were and not wanting to see change happen or wanting to control the change rather than let it sort of evolve naturally, as Beer's whole thing is about, you know, letting this sort of evolution of the system occur in a way that, you know, has some direction but isn't constraining it. You know, it's just like it falls apart. I mean, like and you know, talking about the ways that everyone was like so stretched thin, you know, it's just like all these things that kind of led to this confluence of events obviously culminating in a coup, and it's sad. It's quite sad, and yeah, it also just shows like how important politics is. Like the political question needs to be centered because politics will derail anything. You know, politics in this case being the like exchange and conflict between people and powers. You know, like this is going to destabilize any system because people have their own personal motivations, personal like influences and loyalties, whatever. And you know, it'd be great if everyone was like loyal to the most ideal system, you know, right? And could just sort of subsume whatever beefs they had before to like this project or to whatever project. But like, I think every socialist project bears out the fact that that's not possible, that it's always going to, like these political, like, what's the word? Political currents will shift the best laid plans, you know, and it's important that we not forget that and not try to paper over something. I mean, we can table some political discussions. Like, I don't think we don't need to say like, oh, well, who's going to be the controller of, like, who's going to be the head of the government of the United Socialist States of America? Like, we're not there yet. We don't need to have that like discussion, right? But like some stuff about like, well, who do you want to center in the work that you do? How do you want power to be wielded? How do you want structures to be set up? That stuff is important and does need to like have that political component within it and not be like left to, I don't know. I feel like it can be left to people who just have the time to deal with it. I feel like that's something that happens a lot for sure. Mm-hmm. Just like you have the capacity to like take on the work that needs to be done. No, all right, well then I guess you don't have any like political say in how it gets done. And maybe that's something that we could try and figure out a solution to. But yeah, very sad, and it's a damn shame.
It is a shame what we see happen here, to say the least. We'll get more into that next chapter. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, for example, with the last thing Jake said, something comes to mind is maybe like having more like opt-in forms of governance, where like, you know, these are the people who mostly deal with this, but you know, like if you want to slam on the brakes, like you have a channel like to do that, where you know actually and that'll actually go somewhere. But yeah, I mean, you know, also some echoing the thing of like, how just wrong like the liberal conception of what politics is, where you know we all just come together and we think of like the best solution together, and just having no thought to like different groups and their interests and them acting in you know the interest of their group, as opposed to, and the thing is like it's not even that it's not collectivist, because that's the other like liberal thing that's wrong. You know, they either think in terms of, you know, we're all going for the common good, or, you know, like we're all like atomic actors. Well, no, there are little islands of mutual benefit that, you know, people actually do, you know, work in favor of. You know, people do have small collectivisms. And that's why class politics, like, is how, you know, is the thing that's historically, you know, even if it loses more often than it wins, it's the thing like with the best, you know, success rate against the vampire class. And also I found that last bit of like the evangelical versus the theology. I feel like you know, especially with like his thing of you know, sort of like unlocking the creative potential of people who maybe like weren't involved before. You know, I'm thinking of a metaphor like the way like firebombing like actually worked in like the Second World War was you know, you can't actually burn down the whole city like just from the bombs. Like you have to ignite the city. Like you know, like the bomb has to, you know, turn like the thing into fuel. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, and that's how, you know, evangelism can maybe turn into theology. You know, well, like you know, someone kind of gets on board and, you know, starts to bring what they know to the table, and you know, like that's how you actually progress.
Yes, yeah, certainly very effective in Tokyo, Wooden City. I guess we need to find wooden cities for socialism. But yes, I think that you know, the theology there is I'm not a Catholic to the degree that Beer was a Catholic, so I can't speak too much to what he's saying there. But I think he's talking about the evangelical message being combined with kind of institutional knowledge and lived experience, and that's going to happen more gradually than Beer writing some brilliant document and handing it off to everyone after breakfast before hopping on a plane. But yeah, I mean, it's very, very tight timelines everyone was working on. Okay, well, so next time we're going to move on to the next chapter, which is Chapter 19, The End of the Beginning. So we're gonna get into some proper Thermidor stuff here, and then the final chapter will be Chapter 20, The Prospectus, which covers Beer's sort of post-Chile thoughts on what happened and what might be done differently. So yeah, Chapter 19, let's get ready to get depressed about fascism. But, you know, there'll be some valuable lessons on the other end. So I'll see you then.
Indeed. See you all soon. Bye.
Bye.
Sure.